The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days, and neither had my tears. I stood at the bus stop on Fifth Avenue, clutching a soggy cardboard box that held everything left from my desk. A coffee mug with a crack running down the side, a wilted succulent. I'd somehow managed to kill, despite everyone saying they were impossible to kill, and a letter that still smelled faintly of my manager's expensive perfume. "We regret to inform you," it began, though I doubted anyone in that Glass Tower felt much regret about anything except perhaps their quarterly profits. My phone buzzed. Another text from the landlord. Another reminder that life doesn't pause for your personal catastrophes. I had $14 in my checking account, half a subway card, in exactly 3 weeks, before I'd be putting my belongings on a street corner that looked nothing like the tree-lined avenue I'd imagined when I first moved to this city with stars in my eyes and my grandmother's savings in my pocket. That's when I saw her. She wasn't remarkable at first glance. Middle-aged, maybe 50 or 60, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and a wool coat that had seen better decades. But she was looking at me, really looking, in a way that made me realize I'd become invisible lately, just another shadow passing through the peripheral vision of a city too busy to notice when someone was drowning on dry land. "That box looks heavy," she said, and her voice carried the kind of warmth that reminded me of my grandmother's kitchen on Sunday mornings. I tried to smile, but my face had forgotten how. "It's not the weight," I managed to say. "It's what it represents." She nodded like she understood everything I hadn't said. "I'm Margaret," she said, extending her hand. "And you look like someone who could use a cup of coffee that doesn't taste like battery acid." I should have declined. I should have mumbled something, polite, and kept my problems to myself like my mother always taught me. But there was something about her. Maybe it was the way her eyes crinkled at the corners. Or maybe it was because I was so desperately tired of pretending I was fine that made me nod and follow her down the street to a small cafe I'd walked past 100 times without ever noticing. The place was warm and smelled like cinnamon and possibility. Margaret ordered 2 coffees and a plate of croissants without asking what I wanted, which should have annoyed me, but instead felt like someone had finally taken a decision off my overloaded plate. We sat by the window, rain streaking the glass like the city itself was crying. 23 years ago, Margaret began, stirring cream into her coffee, I stood at a different bus stop with a different box. "But the same expression you had on your face 15 minutes ago." She paused, looking out at the rain. "I'd just lost my teaching job. Budget cuts, they called it. But really, I'd lost my identity. I'd spent 15 years shaping young minds. And suddenly I was just another expense they could eliminate with a signature." I wrapped my hands around the warm mug, feeling the heat seep into my cold fingers. "What did you do?" She smiled, but it was sad around the edges. "I fell apart for a while. Stayed in my apartment, ignored phone calls, convinced myself I was worthless. Then one day a woman I'd never met knocked on my door. She was my neighbor, had been for 3 years, but we'd never spoken. She brought soup and said she'd noticed I hadn't been taking in my mail." Margaret took a sip of her coffee. "That woman Clara, she didn't try to fix me. She didn't tell me everything would be okay or hand me a list of job openings. She just sat with me, listened, came back the next day and the day after that. And slowly I remembered that I was more than my job, that I was still me, even without the title on my business card." "Did you find another teaching position?" I asked, already invested in this stranger's story in a way. I hadn't been invested in anything for weeks. Eventually, yes. But more importantly, I found something else. She leaned forward, her eyes bright with meaning. "I found out that kindness isn't just something nice to do when it's convenient. It's a lifeline we throw to each other when the current gets too strong." I felt something crack open in my chest, something I'd been keeping tightly sealed since the day I got that letter. "I don't know how to be okay with this," I whispered. "I've failed. I worked so hard, did everything right, and I still failed." "You didn't fail," Margaret said firmly. "The system failed you. There's a difference." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "And I'm going to tell you what Clara told me, and what her mother told her during the Depression, and what her grandmother told her mother during times even harder than these. You are not alone. You never have to be alone unless you choose it." Over the next hour, Margaret told me about the community center she'd helped start after getting back on her feet, how it began with just her and Clara, offering free tutoring to neighborhood kids, and had grown into a network of people helping people, job training, resume workshops, even a small food pantry. We all need help sometimes, she said. The trick is building a world where asking for it doesn't feel like admitting defeat. By the time we finished our coffee, she'd written down the address of the community center, 3 job leads her friends had mentioned, and the number of a landlord who was decent and understood that good tenants were worth more than maximum rent. "Why are you doing this?" I asked as we prepared to leave, the rain finally starting to ease. "You don't know me." I could be anyone. Margaret put on her coat and gave me a look that reminded me why I'd become a teacher. In the first place, oh yes, that's what I'd lost. I'd been working in education administration, trying to make a difference from behind a desk. 23 years ago, a stranger showed me that humanity isn't dead. It's just buried under our fear and pride. And I promised myself that if I ever saw someone standing at a bus stop with that look, I'd stop. I'd see them. I'd remind them they matter. She buttoned her coat and smiled. Besides, you're not anyone. You're someone who still holds on to a dying plant because you hope you can save it. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are. I looked down at the succulent in my box, its leaves brown and crispy. It's dead, I said. Maybe, Margaret agreed. Or maybe it just needs better soil and someone who hasn't given up on herself yet. 3 months later, I stood in front of a classroom again. Not my old job, but something better. A position at a charter school in Brooklyn, working with kids who needed someone to believe in them. The pay was less, but my life was richer. I'd moved into an apartment I could actually afford, in a building where neighbors knew each other's names. The succulent sat on my windowsill, sporting 3 new green leaves that I checked on every morning like they were tiny miracles. And every Tuesday evening, I volunteered at Margaret's community center, offering resume help and interview coaching to people who wore that same look I'd had at the bus stop. I learned their names, heard their stories, reminded them that a job loss wasn't a life loss. Last week, I met a young man named David who'd just been let go from his accounting firm. He stood in the doorway of the center looking lost and scared, clutching a cardboard box that held a sad little cactus and a letter that probably started with, "We regret to inform you." I walked over, extended my hand, and said, "That box looks heavy." He tried to smile, but his face hadn't remembered how yet. "It's not the weight," he said. "It's what it represents." I nodded, understanding everything he hadn't said. "I'm Rachel," I said. "And you look like someone who could use a cup of coffee that doesn't taste like battery acid." As we walked to the same cafe where Margaret had taken me, I thought about how kindness works, not in grand gestures or viral moments, but in small acts of witness, in seeing someone's pain and not looking away, in choosing, over and over, to be the person who stops at the bus stop. The rain had started again, light this time, more of a mist than a downpour. David walked beside me, his shoulders slowly relaxing as I told him about Margaret, about Clara, about all the people who'd formed a chain of grace stretching back through time. "Why are you doing this?" he asked as we reached the cafe door. "You don't know me." I smiled, feeling the echo of Margaret's words in my mouth, understanding now what it meant to pass on a gift that had saved my life, because someone once showed me that humanity isn't dead. It's just waiting for us to remember it. And because you're not anyone, you're someone who holds on to a dying cactus because you still have hope. Inside the warm cafe, I ordered 2 coffees and a plate of croissants. Through the window, I could see the bus stop where my life had changed, where a stranger had chosen to see me when I'd become invisible to everyone else, including myself. The city rushed by outside, millions of people carrying their own boxes, their own losses, their own fears. But inside this small cafe, there was warmth and there was witness, and there was the quiet revolution of one person choosing to care for another. No strings attached, no judgment given, just the simple radical act of human kindness. David took a sip of his coffee and asked, "What happens now?" I thought about Margaret, about Clara, about all the people who'd built something beautiful out of their own broken pieces. "Now," I said, "we remember that you're more than your job. and then we figure out what comes next, together. Because that's what she taught me. That's what they all taught me. That in a world that tries to measure our worth in productivity and profit, the most revolutionary thing we can do is simply see each other, help each other, remind each other that we matter not because of what we do, but because of who we are. And maybe that succulent on my windowsill with its 3 new leaves wasn't about the plant at all. Maybe it was about remembering that with the right soil, the right light, the right care, even things we think are dead can bloom again. Even us.